to the rainbow and might even make you cry the next time you see one. It's a story you all know, but there's a deeper meaning here that you probably missed. I found this while listening to a podcast series called 40 Minutes in the Old Testament. I'll link them in the description. They're breaking down the Old Testament bit by bit, and when they got to the story of Noah's Ark, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After the floodwaters recede and the ark lands, Noah takes some clean animals and sacrifices them to God. In turn, God makes a covenant with Noah and all the creatures of the earth. I will establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. But God doesn't stop there. He wants to give Noah and all creation something to remember this promise by. A sign for all people. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever the rainbow appears in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and all living creatures of every kind on the earth. Sounds lovely, right? Well, it turns out we were completely wrong. Turns out the word rainbow isn't actually a Hebrew word at all. When looking at the original text, the word simply translates to bow. So what is this bow God's talking about? The word is used many times to describe a weapon of war, and sometimes even represents the entire military strength of a nation. The rainbow verse after the flood could actually be translated as follows: I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign. This already gives us a deeper meaning that God has retired the weapon of war. No more will he be using the bow of wrath against his creation. It represents peace between God and man. The war is over, and life abounds. But wait, because this is where things get incredible. If the rainbow represents a bow and arrow used to shoot arrows of wrath, the bow of God is now in the sky, drawn tight. But which way is it facing? God's arrow of wrath was pointed at the earth, but is now pointed into the sky, at himself. The peace between God and man had to come at a cost, and that cost was Jesus. Jesus took the arrows of God's wrath on the cross so that our covenant of peace with him could be everlasting, just as he said it would be. It's pretty simple to see Moses as this brilliant, near flawless man of God. Here's a guy who spoke to God face to face. But what if I were to tell you that Moses made a mistake so significant that God punished him with death sooner than Moses had hoped? An infraction that seems so small on the surface, but actually reveals Moses' profound lack of faith in God's plan, not just for the Israelites, but for the future generations to come thousands of years later. Let's set the scene. Moses is in the desert with the Israelites, having led them out of Egypt. They've just crossed the Red Sea, and they've had the added bonus of seeing their Egyptian persecutors swept away behind them. They've had bitter water purified so it's drinkable. They've had manna and quail rain down from heaven, and after all that, they decide to complain again. It gets so bad that they want to stone Moses for dragging them out of Egypt. So Moses calls out for help, and God says to strike a rock with his staff. Miraculously, drinking water comes pouring out. Sometime later, a similar situation happens in the wilderness of Zin. This time Moses strikes the rock and water comes out again. This seems like a consistent formula, but the second time God gets angry at Moses. In fact, he's so angry that Moses pays with his life, keeping him from experiencing the promised land. The first time God told Moses to strike the rock, but this time he told him to speak to it. Moses hits the rock in rage and is immediately rebuked by God. At face value, this seems unfair. But there's more to the story than meets the eye. There's something important to notice before the events. God tells Moses to gather the people and the elders to see this miracle take place. Not only that, but in the second instance, Moses, no doubt frustrated with the rebellious Israelites, almost taunts them, asking them if he and Aaron should bring water out of the rock for them. Moses had been instructed by God to raise his staff over the Red Sea, to put it in the Nile to turn it into blood, and to throw it on the ground and watch it turn into a snake, and to finally strike the rock and water would come out. The staff had been a central part of the miracles God had worked through Moses. Perhaps this is partly why, along with his temper, Moses found it hard to follow through with his command. But there is a passage in the New Testament which gives us some essential insight in understanding this story. Remember how Jesus spoke in parables? I am the vine, I am the gate, I am the bread of life, etc. And did you know that Jesus was described as the rock? And not just any rock, but the rock from which living water flows. Jesus said, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink, and that whoever believes in him will have living water flow from them." But that's only part of the answer, because Paul says something absolutely profound in 1 Corinthians. Paul takes Jesus right to our Exodus story, saying that Jesus was the rock in the wilderness, and that the Israelites drank from him. Now I'm going to explain to you a final piece of information that will transform the lives of anyone who hears it. So I hope you're paying attention. Jesus often spoke in parables and symbolic language, which can be rather annoying to some people. But it's an attribute God has. Jesus said he only spoke the words his Father gave him. With this in mind, consider this story of Moses and the rock in Deuteronomy. God tells Moses to strike the rock once. The rock that is Jesus. This is a symbol of God's plan to strike Jesus for our sins, sacrificing him once for all to provide us with the living water Jesus promised. Remember how Jesus was struck with a spear and water flowed out? I don't think that was a coincidence. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Jesus was to be sacrificed once and only once. God was communicating that through Moses, Jesus would be sacrificed once for all. So why did Moses get in trouble for hitting the rock a second time? Well, it seems that the second occurrence of the rock and water symbolizes our new relationship with God. Since Jesus died on the cross for us, we can now access the living water of God by simply speaking to him. The rock has already been struck, the water has been poured out. That same water is readily available for us to take if we are willing to humble ourselves before God and enter a relationship with him, one where we can converse and speak and be renewed by the living water that he offers. We all know about the story of Saul, the man who persecuted Christians across the known world. Well, this story isn't about him. This is the story of another Saul, a tall man who was the first to be anointed king of Israel. But it might surprise you to hear that Saul took on a title that one could argue is rarer and more valuable than that of being a king. A title that few throughout history have ever held. Saul and David started on good terms, and they only got better when David dealt with Goliath on his behalf. But as David began to rise, jealousy overtook Saul, and he started to despise him. After trying to kill him, David escaped, leaving an idol with goat's hair in his bed as a dummy. Humiliated and furious, Saul investigated and learnt that David had fled to Naioth, so he sent soldiers there to arrest him. As it turns out, David fled to meet with Samuel, and when the soldiers arrived to arrest David, they met Samuel and a group prophesying to the Lord. For whatever reason, the Spirit of God overcame them and they joined the prophets in prophesying to the Lord. Frustrated, Saul sends 2 more detachments of soldiers, both who succumb to the same fate. They start prophesying and fail to arrest David. Saul had had enough, so he left himself for Naioth. But something incredible happened. The Spirit of God came upon even Saul, and he began prophesying also. He tore off his clothes and started prophesying before he even arrived at Samuel's location. What the heck is going on here? You see, the prophets had special actions they had to undertake as part of their prophecy. Things that the prophets did that were symbolic of a greater message. For example, Jeremiah brought a linen belt and then hid it near the river Euphrates. Because the pretty linen belt disintegrated, symbolizing the pride of Jerusalem, Ezekiel drew a map of Jerusalem and laid siege to it with miniature siege engines. Not because he enjoyed childish games, but because it symbolized how Jerusalem would be destroyed. Hosea was commanded to marry a prostitute, because this marriage was symbolic of God's relationship with a rebellious and unfaithful Israel. And now we get to Saul, who also prophesied, but naked. If all these other prophets carried significant meaning in their signs, surely Saul's is no different. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 15 with me. In this chapter we see that Saul has disobeyed a command of God. This command was to destroy all the Amalekites. But Saul decided to keep some of the choice livestock alive, including the king of the Amalekites himself. For this act of disobedience, God takes the kingship away from Saul. In 1 Samuel 19, we see this play out prophetically. Notice that it says Saul prophesied naked. Well, to be naked, he had to take his kingly garments off. God was speaking through Saul himself, saying that Saul had been stripped of his kingship. So the final line of the passage where the people ask, "Is Saul also among the prophets?" is answered, yes. But unfortunately, he prophesied his very own fall from power.